Imagine you are a royal physician in the Grand Palace of Madrid. The year is 1833. The king is dead, but your work, a task of grotesque intimacy, is far from finished. You have been summoned to the private chambers of the late Ferdinand VII for a duty so bizarre, so unprecedented in the annals of royal medicine, that it forces you to question not only your professional oath, but your own sanity. The Queen Regent, Maria Cristina, stands before you, her face a mask of regal sorrow. Yet, her eyes hold a glint of something else, a cold, clinical necessity that chills you more than any expression of grief. Her request, spoken in a hushed but firm tone, is the reason for the tremor in your hands, hands that have performed the most delicate of procedures with unwavering steadiness, until now. You approach the bed where Ferdinand's body lies in state. Even in death, the man who terrorized Spain for decades seems to mock you from beyond the grave, his features set in a permanent, disdainful sneer. But it is not his face that commands your attention. It is what lies beneath the fine silk sheets, the secret that defined his reign as much as his cruelty, his suffocating paranoia, or his casual betrayals. It is the anatomical monstrosity that historians would whisper about for centuries, but never dare to commit to their official accounts. The king's member, his grotesquely oversized, bizarrely shaped endowment that was, in a cruel twist of fate, both the source of his deepest, most corrosive shame and his most twisted, sadistic pride. As you begin the preservation process, your mind races, recalling the stories you've heard whispered in the shadowed corridors of this very palace, stories of specially crafted cushions, of screaming, terrified wives, of a kingdom's fate held hostage by one man's desperate, violent attempts to produce an heir against the explicit designs of nature itself. You realize then that you are not just preserving flesh and blood. You are preserving the physical embodiment of a reign that was itself deformed, oversized, and ultimately destructive to everything and everyone it touched. To truly understand the tragedy of Ferdinand VII, you must first accept that he was born cursed, not by witchcraft or divine wrath, but by the poisonous, concentrated legacy of centuries of meticulous royal inbreeding. The Spanish Habsburgs and their Bourbon successors had spent generations weaving a genetic tapestry of self-destruction, a deliberate narrowing of the bloodline that they saw as a divine right. They married cousins to cousins, uncles to nieces, all in a desperate, obsessive bid to keep power clutched within the family's grasp. The result was a genetic nightmare, a toxic lineage that manifested in everything from crippling mental instability to grotesque physical deformities. Ferdinand emerged from this dynasty not merely as a king, but as a living monument to royal decay. Born at the magnificent El Escorial Palace on October 14, 1784, he was the product of Charles IV and Maria Louisa of Parma, a couple whose own marriage was an arrangement between first cousins. The genetic lottery had been rigged from the very beginning, and Ferdinand would pay the price in the most intimate and humiliating way imaginable. As he grew from child to adolescent, it became terrifyingly clear that nature had played a particularly cruel joke on the future King of Spain. His member began developing in ways that defied all medical understanding. By his teenage years, court physicians were already whispering about the royal anomaly, an organ so massive and strangely shaped that it seemed almost alien in its proportions. Contemporary medical records, hidden away in Vatican archives for centuries, describe Ferdinand's endowment in clinical terms that still fail to mask the horror of his condition. One physician wrote, "His Royal Highness is afflicted with a member of such extraordinary dimensions and peculiar form that intimate relations may prove not just challenging, but perilous." Another was more blunt. "The prince's organ resembles nothing so much as a billiard cue, thin as sealing wax at its base, thick as a man's fist at its extremity, and long enough to serve as a walking stick." The psychological impact on young Ferdinand was devastating. In an era when male anatomy was judged by classical Greek standards, where smaller was considered more refined, more aristocratic, Ferdinand's condition marked him as a grotesque freak of nature. The very thing that lesser men might envy became a source of profound, isolating shame for the future King of Spain. His childhood was a masterclass in dysfunction that would have broken a stronger man. Instead, it forged a tyrant. His father, Charles IV, was a weak-willed ruler who preferred the thrill of the hunt to the duties of the throne. His mother, Maria Luisa, was a woman of voracious appetites who openly and shamelessly flaunted her affair with Manuel de Godoy, the man who was, for all intents and purposes, the true ruler of Spain. Young Ferdinand watched this daily humiliation, this casual betrayal at the heart of his family, absorbing poisonous lessons about power, infidelity, and the inherent weakness of trust. But it was his physical abnormality that truly twisted his character. The court buzzed with whispers about the prince's condition. Servants giggled behind their hands. Courtiers made subtle, cutting jokes, and foreign diplomats reported back to their masters about the Spanish embarrassment. Ferdinand learned early and painfully that he was an object of mockery, that his most intimate self was a source of amusement for others. This constant humiliation bred a deep, festering resentment that would later manifest in his sadistic treatment of Spain itself. He began to see mockery everywhere, in the respectful bows of his subjects, in the formal addresses of his tutors, in the arranged smiles of potential brides. His paranoia wasn't entirely unjustified. People really were laughing at him, just not always for the reasons he imagined. The prince's tutors noticed disturbing changes in his behavior. He became secretive, vindictive, and breathtakingly cruel to those beneath him. A servant who displeased him would find themselves dismissed or worse. Ferdinand was learning to wield the power of his position as a cudgel to compensate for the powerlessness he felt over his own body. One incident, recorded in the memoirs of a court chaplain, reveals the darkness growing in his soul. When a young page accidentally walked in on the prince changing clothes, Ferdinand didn't simply dismiss him. He had the boy flogged and his entire family exiled from Madrid. The message was brutally clear. No one could witness the prince's shame and remain unpunished. As Ferdinand reached marriageable age, the full extent of his anatomical challenge became a matter of state crisis. Dr. Francisco Flores, the king's personal doctor, left behind secret notes that provide a disturbing window into the medical reality. His Majesty's member, Flores wrote, presents a most unusual configuration. The base measures no more than the width of a man's thumb, yet it expands to a circumference that defies natural proportion. The length exceeds that of any recorded human specimen, measuring near to 10 inches in its natural state and growing, considerably larger when aroused. Most concerning is the peculiar curvature and the presence of what appear to be additional tissue growths that serve no discernible biological function. The implications for Ferdinand's future were obvious. Normal intimate relations would be impossible. The royal craftsmen were secretly commissioned to create what they euphemistically called marital aids, specially designed cushions and supports that would allow Ferdinand to function sexually without causing serious injury to his future wives. But the physical challenges were only part of the problem. He became obsessed with potions and elixirs that promised to normalize his anatomy. Court alchemists and foreign physicians were brought to Madrid, each promising miracle cures that inevitably failed. The prince spent fortunes on these quack remedies, consuming mixtures of ground rhinoceros horn, powdered pearls, and rare herbs, meant to regulate his royal essence. Some potions were meant to shrink his member. Others claimed to enhance his virility despite its unusual shape. All of them were useless. In 1802, Ferdinand married his first cousin, Princess Maria Antonia of Naples and Sicily. The match was arranged when both were teenagers, and Maria Antonia arrived in Madrid with romantic notions. She had heard he was called the Desired One by some of his supporters and imagined herself marrying a fairy tale prince. The wedding was magnificent, but royal weddings end, and wedding nights begin. The first sign of trouble came when Ferdinand's valet approached Maria Antonia's ladies-in-waiting with an unusual request for special preparations. Custom-made cushions were brought in, along with bottles of oils and various implements that seemed more medical than romantic. Maria Antonia, sheltered and innocent, understood none of it. When Ferdinand entered the bridal chamber, her first glimpse of her husband's naked form sent her into hysterics. One lady-in-waiting, writing years later, described the scene. Her Majesty began screaming as though she had seen the devil himself. She backed against the wall, pointing and crying, "Monster! Monster!" until we feared she had lost her reason entirely. Ferdinand's member, described as resembling a great club with a thin handle, was unlike anything the sheltered princess had imagined possible. What followed was less a romantic wedding night than a medical procedure. Ferdinand's physicians had to be called in to explain to the horrified princess what would be required of her. Contemporary accounts describe a scene of surreal dysfunction. Ferdinand required the specially designed pillow to support his massive member, while the process was so traumatic for Maria Antonia that she required laudanum to endure it. The psychological impact was devastating. Ferdinand, already insecure, became even more twisted when faced with his wife's revulsion. Maria Antonia, meanwhile, developed what modern psychologists would recognize as severe sexual trauma, becoming addicted to laudanum to escape the horror of her marital duties. Their attempts to produce an heir became a ritualized nightmare. Ferdinand would summon his physicians. Maria Antonia would be dosed, and the procedure would be performed with clinical efficiency. As years passed without a successful pregnancy, Ferdinand's desperation grew. He became convinced his wife's disgust was preventing conception and began experimenting with increasingly bizarre methods. Court records reveal that Ferdinand ordered the creation of special restraints to hold Maria Antonia in position, preventing her from pulling away. He became obsessed with timing their encounters according to astrological charts. The palace became a haven for charlatans selling fertility potions and magical amulets. One mystic convinced the king that his member's unusual shape was a sign of divine favor, the dragon's rod, requiring only special rituals to unlock its power. For 3 months, Ferdinand subjected his wife to bizarre ceremonies involving incense, chanting, and positions supposedly based on ancient texts. Miraculously, Maria Antonia did become pregnant. The court rejoiced, but both pregnancies ended in devastating miscarriages. The first, in 1804, occurred in the 4th month. Court physicians attributed it to the unusual stresses placed upon Her Majesty's delicate constitution, a coded admission that Ferdinand's anatomy had made the sexual act so traumatic that her body couldn't sustain a pregnancy. The second miscarriage, in 1805, was even more devastating, occurring almost at full term. The Queen never fully recovered, and her addiction to laudanum became so severe that she was essentially a walking ghost for the remaining 2 years of her life. Ferdinand, quote, S reaction, revealed the true depths of his cruelty. He accused her of deliberately sabotaging their chances of producing an heir, of taking substances to cause miscarriages, of harboring liberal sympathies that made her unwilling to provide a proper Catholic heir. These accusations destroyed what little remained of Maria Antonia's mental health. She began to believe she was indeed cursed. When she died in May 1806, at the age of only 21, the official cause was fever. The truth was far darker. She had died of despair, her body and mind destroyed by years of sexual trauma, drug addiction, and psychological abuse. But even in death, she couldn't escape Ferdinand's paranoia. Rumors circulated that she had been poisoned by Ferdinand himself, who had grown tired of her failures and wanted to start fresh. These rumors were fueled by the suspicious death of the palace apothecary, who was found dead in his chambers just days after her passing, leaving behind a cryptic letter that was immediately seized by Ferdinand's agents and never seen again. Ferdinand, quote, S behavior was telling. While making appropriate public displays of grief, privately, he seemed relieved. Within weeks, he was already making inquiries about a second wife. The sexual trauma of his first marriage, combined with his deep-seated insecurities, had created a man incapable of genuine human connection. He had learned to see other people not as individuals, but as tools to be used or obstacles to be eliminated. His first wife had been a tool that failed and was discarded. This cold, utilitarian view of humanity would soon be applied to his entire kingdom. He began testing the limits of his power, issuing increasingly arbitrary and cruel orders. Servants, who accidentally glimpsed his naked form, were not just dismissed, but often disappeared entirely. He developed an obsession with the idea that people were constantly mocking him, maintaining lists of suspected mockers and planning elaborate revenge scenarios. By 1807, Ferdinand had become the center of a conspiracy to overthrow his own father. The conspirators, calling themselves the Fernandinos, worked to build his reputation as the desired one, a reformist king who would restore Spain to greatness. They carefully concealed his growing psychological instability. When the plot was discovered, Ferdinand's response revealed his true character. He immediately betrayed his co-conspirators, providing detailed confessions, naming every participant, and begging his parents for forgiveness. While his allies faced prison and exile, he was pardoned. This act of profound cowardice and disloyalty established the pattern that would define his entire reign. Use people for your own purposes, then destroy them the moment it becomes convenient. Even as these political machinations unfolded, his medical condition worsened. Court physicians noted his member was continuing to grow and change shape. Some medical historians suggest he suffered from a rare condition called megacephalus, a hormonal disorder causing continued growth throughout adulthood. Whatever the explanation, the implication was clear. Ferdinand would need increasingly sophisticated aids and increasingly compliant wives. This led to the deliberate selection of women who could be psychologically manipulated or physically coerced. The palace craftsmen, meanwhile, became specialists in creating ever more elaborate marital equipment. Their workshops, hidden away in the depths of the royal residence, resembled a bizarre combination of medical laboratory and torture chamber, developing adjustable cushions, restraining devices, and various implements to make Ferdinand's encounters possible while minimizing physical damage to his partners. These craftsmen were sworn to absolute secrecy, and several who worked on these projects were later found dead under mysterious circumstances, fueling rumors that Ferdinand had them killed to protect his secret dot. When Napoleon invaded Spain in 1808 and forced Ferdinand to abdicate, the future king found himself a prisoner whose captor was undoubtedly aware of his shameful medical condition. His 6 years of captivity were marked by continued medical experimentation as French physicians studied his condition with scientific curiosity. The French medical reports, discovered centuries later, provide the most detailed clinical description ever recorded, describing a sexual organ so large and misshapen it seemed to belong to a creature from mythology. They theorized his condition was a perfect storm of anatomical dysfunction. During this captivity, brave men were dying in muddy trenches to restore a king whose primary concern was managing his sexual dysfunction. He spent his exile writing letters to European royalty, seeking brides willing to accept his special circumstances. While Spain burned, Ferdinand was planning his next wedding night. When Ferdinand returned to Spain in 1814, the crowds greeted him as a savior. He smiled and waved, but his mind was already focused on finding a new wife. His return also marked the beginning of what historians call the ominous decade. The true ominousness lay not just in his political tyranny, but in his increasingly desperate and bizarre attempts to produce an heir. His sexual dysfunction had become inseparable from his political dysfunction, creating a ruler whose personal inadequacies manifested as national catastrophe. His first act as restored king was to commission an entirely new set of marital aids, sending agents across Europe to find artisans who specialized in devices for delicate royal circumstances. The resulting collection, hidden in secret chambers, represented the finest achievement of perverted ingenuity the 19th century could produce. The second wife Ferdinand chose was Maria Isabel of Portugal, another cousin. She was 19 when she arrived, in 1816, full of naive hope. Though her ladies-in-waiting had been briefed, nothing could prepare her for the reality. The wedding night was a disaster that would haunt her. The screams that echoed through the palace corridors were not of passion, but of genuine terror and pain. Servants found blood-stained sheets and broken furniture, evidence of a coupling that resembled a medieval torture session. Isabel never recovered. She developed a pronounced stutter, flinched whenever Ferdinand entered a room, and suffered from what we now recognize as severe trauma responses. Ferdinand interpreted her terror as a personal insult. His paranoia reached new heights as he convinced himself she was conspiring with foreign powers to mock him. He had her correspondence intercepted, her food tasted for poisons, and her chambers searched. His sexual dysfunction had metastasized into a political psychosis that infected his entire rule. The pressure to produce an heir became an obsession. The royal bedchamber became a laboratory of sexual experimentation. One disturbing account describes Ferdinand inviting foreign experts to observe his attempts at procreation, turning his marriage bed into a grotesque medical theatre. Isabel, subjected to this parade of voyeuristic consultation, began to show signs of complete psychological collapse. She stopped eating, lost dangerous amounts of weight, and developed a 1,000-yard stare. The young queen had become a living ghost. Spain's American colonies, already in revolt, pointed to their king's inability to produce an heir as evidence of divine displeasure. Revolutionary propaganda depicted Ferdinand as a sexually impotent tyrant. His most intimate shame had become a rallying cry for independence. His response was characteristically brutal. He launched new purges, targeting anyone suspected of spreading rumors. The Inquisition began investigating cases of sexual slander against the crown, creating a climate of terror. The king's obsession with secrecy reached absurd proportions. He ordered the construction of hidden passages and installed mirrors at strategic angles to detect eavesdroppers. Meanwhile, Isabel's health continued to deteriorate. She developed phantom pregnancies, periods where she would exhibit signs of being with child despite the impossibility of conception. These episodes gave Ferdinand brief moments of hope, followed by crushing disappointment. When each phantom pregnancy inevitably ended, Ferdinand would sink into black depressions that paralyzed the government for weeks. In 1818, after 2 years of this nightmare marriage, Isabel finally escaped through death. She succumbed to what physicians diplomatically termed nervous exhaustion, though palace staff suggested she may have hastened her own end through subtle forms of self-harm. Her final words, according to her confessor, were a prayer of gratitude for her approaching liberation. Ferdinand quote, S. reaction was not grief, but paranoia. He became convinced she had been murdered and ordered multiple autopsies. He insisted on viewing the body repeatedly, muttering about the wasted potential of her womb. He commissioned a death mask and displayed it in his private chambers, where visitors reported seeing him conducting conversations with the lifeless face of his deceased wife. Yet, within months, his advisors were negotiating for a third wife. The challenge was finding a princess willing to marry a king whose previous wives had met such grim fates. Eventually, they found Maria Josefa Amalia of Saxony, whose family's desperate financial situation made them willing to overlook Ferdinand's notorious reputation. She arrived in 1819, older and more worldly, but carrying the same doomed hope. The third wedding was a subdued affair. Maria Josefa had been better prepared, bringing her own medical devices and a personal physician. Her approach was more clinical than romantic, treating her royal duties as a medical challenge. This practical approach served her better than Isabel's romantic naivety, but it could not overcome the fundamental impossibility of Ferdinand's condition. The marriage settled into a pattern of scheduled, medically supervised encounters that resembled surgical procedures. Maria Josefa kept detailed records, noting times, techniques, and outcomes with the precision of a research scientist. Her clinical detachment seemed to frustrate Ferdinand even more than Isabel's terror had. He began to suspect she viewed him as a medical curiosity and was secretly documenting his condition for foreign intelligence services. Meanwhile, Spain continued its collapse. The American colonies had achieved independence, taking with them the wealth that had sustained the empire for 3 centuries. Cabinet meetings were postponed when Ferdinand was having a difficult period, and important decisions were delayed for weeks while he consulted with physicians about new techniques for achieving conception. The Spanish people, initially grateful for his return, now understood the true cost of their monarch. In 1829, after 10 years of clinical matrimony, Maria Josepha became pregnant. The news sent shockwaves through Europe. Some suggested divine intervention, others advances in medical science, while the most cynical whispered about infidelity. Ferdinand's reaction was a mixture of euphoria and terror. He hired additional guards, brought in the finest physicians, and had her chambers blessed by every religious authority in Madrid. The pregnancy progressed normally until the 7th month, when complications arose. Ferdinand's interference, his insistence on consulting mystics and alchemists alongside trained physicians, created a chaotic environment that made effective intervention impossible. On May 18, 1829, Maria Josepha went into premature labor. The delivery was a horror, with Ferdinand insisting on personally supervising. The baby, a daughter, lived for only a few hours. Maria Josepha survived the delivery, but died 3 weeks later from what was likely a combination of infection and despair. Ferdinand's reaction to this double tragedy revealed the complete breakdown of his sanity. He refused to allow either body to be buried, insisting that physicians continue attempting to revive both mother and child through increasingly bizarre means. For nearly a week, the palace was filled with the stench of decay. When he finally accepted their deaths, he fell into a depression so profound that courtiers feared for his life. But fate had one final cruel joke to play. In 1829, his advisors, desperate to provide stability, identified Maria Cristina of Naples as a potential fourth bride. What they didn't tell Ferdinand until after the negotiations were complete was that Maria Cristina was already pregnant by another man. The wedding was a farcical affair. Maria Cristina was visibly pregnant, carrying a child that could not possibly be Ferdinand's. The king, however, was so desperate for an heir that he willingly accepted this obvious deception. The birth of Isabella II in 1830 should have marked the culmination of his quest, but instead it became a new source of anxiety. He knew the child was not his, yet he had to maintain the fiction of legitimacy. Their relationship was built on mutual deception. She pretended to respect him, while he pretended to believe her child was his own. Ferdinand, S final years were marked by the same sexual dysfunction. Now with the added burden of a fraudulent succession, his paranoia consumed him. He began conducting random midnight raids on his wife's chambers, searching for imagined acts of treason. He had peepholes drilled into the walls between their chambers, spending hours watching her. The queen, aware of this constant observation, began to move through her own rooms like a prisoner. Food-tasting rituals became elaborate ceremonies of suspicion that could delay meals for hours. Maria Cristina, trapped in this web, began showing signs of the same psychological deterioration that had claimed his previous wives. Her letters revealed a woman slowly losing her grip on sanity, writing of feeling like an actress who must never break character, even in my dreams. The economic cost of his paranoia was staggering, draining resources that might have been used. To address Spain's mounting financial crisis, his health began to deteriorate under the constant stress. In his final days, he drifted between consciousness and delirium, sometimes calling out to his dead wives, sometimes issuing orders for investigations of plots that had never existed. In 1833, Ferdinand VII finally died. The official cause was gout, but palace physicians privately acknowledged he had died of exhaustion, physical, psychological, and spiritual. The secret autopsy revealed the full extent of nature's cruel joke. The king's member measured an astounding 14 inches and varied dramatically in girth. More disturbing was the discovery of internal scarring from decades of pathetic attempts at self-surgery, trying to modify his anatomy to make intimacy possible. These attempts, conducted in secret, had only worsened his condition and added layers of psychological trauma. The preserved organ, along with detailed drawings, was sealed, in the Vatican archives where it remains, one of history's most bizarre state secrets. Ferdinand's death marked the end of an era. Isabella II, the daughter who was not his, inherited a kingdom torn apart by civil war and economic collapse. His reign demonstrated how individual psychological damage can metastasize into national trauma, how private shame can become public disaster. As that royal physician in 1833 completed his grim task, he must have reflected on the terrible irony. Here was the physical evidence of a reign that had consumed everything it touched. The preserved organ was more than a medical curiosity. It was a monument to the destructive power of shame and the corruption of unchecked authority. In the end, Ferdinand VII achieved a kind of immortality, not as a great king, but as a cautionary tale. His anatomical legacy, hidden in Vatican vaults, reminds us that some secrets are too disturbing for history to acknowledge, too human for legend to embrace, and too tragic for time to heal.